Okay, it is a couple minutes after 4, so I'm excited to get started. My name is Juan He, and I'm an assistant professor of English. Thank you so much, English at Vanderbilt University. And thank you so much for joining us today, this afternoon, for the Disco Graduate Scholar Lightning Talks. I'm just going to share some slides to introduce this event and disco and talk about some upcoming slide events that we have as well. So just give me 1 second to share some slides. Okay. So just a few notes in terms of getting started. If you have an access or technology related concern, please just send a message via chat to Charisse Chan. And if you have any questions for the speakers, you can also use the chat throughout all the presentations. And this is a closed session, which will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube, so you can access and rewatch the talks. So a little bit more about me. Like I said, my name is Juan. I'm a Disco faculty affiliate with Disco. I'm currently at Vanderbilt and assistant professor of English. And I have a PhD in American Studies and Ethnicity from USC. Broadly, my research is on Asian American culture, digital studies, and game studies. And I also write poetry. In terms of, just making sure I didn't skip a slide. So here at the DSI, we are committed to accessibility and digital equity. And for these reasons, we invite you as audience members to really experience the event however you want, however you feel is appropriate. So we want you to really be comfortable. Card captioning is available and may be accessed via the show captions option on Zoom. And just to really quickly share a few upcoming events that should be pretty exciting to check out. But we have an event with search engines called Rather a Jinn Than a Cyborg, and it's a conversation with Morsheen Alahyari. And I'm just going to read the description for the event. From 3D printed replicas of sculptures destroyed by ISIS to interactive installations and hypertext fables that infuse medieval fable with contemporary gender politics, to purpose-built generative AI aimed at recovering lost queer traditions in Persian art, Mohsen Alahyari's work leverages storytelling, archival research, and new technology as tools to push back against Western colonialism. And this event will take place on May 16th from 4 to 6 p.m. on Zoom. So hope to see you there. And we also have an exciting Disco Summit, a kind of really big culminating event happening at the University of Michigan. It's both an in-person event as well as accessible on Zoom on June 14th to 15th. So in a couple of months. And it's a 2-day summer symposium with 9 different panel conversations about the intersection between digital technology, culture, race, disability, gender, sexuality, and liberation. And today we're going to be celebrating and conversing with our Disco graduate scholars. So this program is really designed for graduate student researchers committed to developing interdisciplinary work about the intersection between digital technology, culture, race, disability, gender, sexuality, and liberation. And all of our graduate scholars have been doing great research and been in conversation and in collaboration with our PIs. So I'll be introducing all of the scholars individually as they come on deck for their lightning talks. Without further ado, we're just going to get started with our first speaker, Ria Rajan, who will be presenting a talk called Drifting Through the Technosphere. And Ria Rajan is from Stony Brook University.
Give me a second. I'm just about to share my screen. Are we good? Yes, we're good. Okay. Hi, I'm Ria. I am a second year MFA student at Stony Brook University. I'm also a research assistant at the Future History Studio with Stephanie Jenkins. And today My talk is called Drifting Through the Technosphere. I'm going to give you a little overview of my practice and delve into two projects which look at all the things that I'm interested in. Okay, so a little bit about me. I am an artist. I am almost as old as the internet. My coming of age happened very much in parallel with the coming of age of the World Wide Web. And so I think of myself as a person of the internet. As a person, also, I was born and raised in India. I moved to the US, to the East Coast, to go to school here about a year and a half ago. Just something to keep in mind when you're looking at the work. So I also moved around a lot as I was growing up, and as someone who grew up on the move, I've become very adept and at ease with changing environments and shifting landscapes. And movement and stasis have become the primary lens through which I process the world and continues to be a source of inquiry. And this very idea of mobility has led to the cultivation of a creative art practice that is inherently itinerant in nature. Just an overview of my practice. Sorry, I can't see my screen. Sorry, I've lost my screen. Okay, thinking about my practice, just some bullet points that I feel like highlight the things that I'm interested in is that I'm focused on materiality, on spatiality. My work tends to be process driven, and a lot of my research is practice based research. On the right, you see I also tend to think of my practice as an intermediate process or practice. And this is like a chart from 95 that was created by an artist, Dick Higgins, who was an influential person in the Fluxus movement. And I thought this was really, it was relevant to how I think about my work. And I just highlighted some of the aspects that I feel like my work tends to gravitate towards. And in doing so, I've also started thinking about what does it mean to have a contemporary intermedia practice. And so in my work, there tends to be a couple of these themes. One is a marrying of the analog and the digital. I also tend to create hybrid expanded objects and interventions that exist online in the ether, as I like to think of it, as well as physically offline. I'm very much invested in thinking about the body, our bodies and technology, my body and technology. And recently I was pointed towards thinking about our bodies as technology. And I also tend to do a lot of drawing and body scale drawing and embodied drawing. And it's one of the ways that I've been thinking about how does one move through space through drawing. So the first project that I would like to talk about today is called How to Find Your Center. And this was a durational work that lasted actually over fall, winter, spring of 2002. What am I saying? Of 2022 into 2023, and then like later on resulted in a solo show later in 2023. This kind of began as an exploration of my environment in moving here. It was a completely new place. I was trying to make sense of what does it mean to be in a new geography, in a new landscape. How does my body respond to this space? And also more in a very like primal and basic way, like how do I assimilate or how do I ground myself in a new landscape? And the site that I was working on was this outdoor site outside our studios. And what began as a sort of meditative process also made me set up certain parameters for me to exist in this specific site over a specific amount of time. And I was essentially drawing with my body in this site. What I started doing was like I timed myself. I did this for over a duration of 20 days, and I was going out there every single day at a specific time, which was 4 p.m. when the light was really nice outside. And I started sharing these instances. I'd like to think of them as instances through my Instagram as like a live feed every single day. It was one way for me to share this experience of being in this new place with my people and who I felt were very far away from me then. And going live was a way to stay connected and have them be able to tune in and be part of this process with me. And so I feel like with this work, it was very much like in the sharing of it, it was very much kind of thinking from how do I make this process available like online first. And then there was very much a physical experience that was happening on site. And so, in continuing to think about bridging this digital and a very physical experience, I'm just going to show you this is a little bit of a quick sort of documentation of the outside. I'm just going to skip through it to just give you a sense of it. Anyway, so what this ended up being was that so I had a lot of like sort of visual material that came out of this process, and I spent a lot of time thinking about like how all of this sort of these questions and these like this research was going to come together into some kind of physical form, and it resulted in an artist book called The Site. And it was a single edition. Again, it was digitally printed, and then I went in and manipulated it by hand. It has like hand done lettering. It has digital collages of like images from the site. And then in trying to think of like how to then translate this into work that could then become an art product, because I'm an artist and that's what we do, I was starting to think about like my solo show, and I was trying to translate what this sort of activity that I was doing on in this outdoor site could translate into something that I could bring into a gallery. And anyway, it resulted in this. I'd like to think of it as an event score, which overall framed this body of work. And so the piece that I ended up doing for my show, it was called How to Find Your Center. And it gives you a little bit of a breakdown of the process of what I was thinking of and like just in the framing of the work. And so this is what happened inside the gallery space. So I replicated some of my sort of movements and actions that I was doing outside and translated that into an actual drawing inside the gallery. And in the same way of using duration and repetition and like my body and movement, I came up with like I would go in there every single day and draw this circle in the middle of the gallery, and it became this like evolving, growing artwork that was changing and was like responding to the gallery as a space as well. This is me in the gallery, going in there every day, sort of doing my thing. Okay, and oops. Okay. And now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about my next project called Drifting Through the Cyberverse, which is a little departure from a very analog and physical work. This second piece is a little bit more digital and in kind of thinking about speculative spaces or creating a sense of kind of playing with the same ideas of like movement and spatiality, but from a little bit of a like from a not tethered to a specific site. And this, I like to think of this work as like an audio-visual spatial exploration. And this work was very much inspired by situationist theories and ideas of psychogeography. Drifting Through the Cyberverse is a poetic wandering through digitally constructed world consisting of moving sculptures composed of disembodied sound and video field recordings, playing and blurring the lines between the virtual and physical space and realities. And some of the things that I was thinking about was just like how relational we are, or at least I am, in how one navigates through space, thinking about shifting perspectives and also playing a little bit with spatialized sound. So I'm gonna play this video a little bit. Okay, that's it. That's where I'm at. Thank you.
Thank you, Ria. I am really impressed and interested in these two very different works.
Mhm.
I'm also excited to see the kind of claiming of social media space as an aesthetic space, because I think there's a lot of negative press about young women in particular. So when you talked about you're using the outdoors as a way to, ground yourself, find your center, especially in contrast with your second one, where the center is always moving and it's not a human space in the kind of typical way. Seeing these two things that kind of came up not too far apart are about movement, drifting, wandering, drawing. It was really dynamic and interesting to see. And also your mastery of these different forms, digital animation, performance, which I think, was anyone watching you do the circle? I don't know if it was the thing that you did by yourself or if someone saw it, but the kind of broad expression across lots of different space is very much like what you say, intermedia. So thank you very much for sharing it. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ria. That was really great. And thanks, Lisa, as well. So just moving right along, next up we have Tynesha McCullers from North Carolina State University, who will be presenting BPG.com, an examination of Black grief and commemorative practices in the digital context.
Can y'all see my screen okay? Perfect. I'm gonna present, if it'll let me. Oh, it's not, okay, there we go. Perfect. No, 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 no. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tynesha McCullers. I use she, her pronouns. I am a PhD student at North Carolina State studying communication rhetoric and digital media and a graduate fellow of the Black Communication and Technology Lab. Today, I'll be presenting BPG, which stands for Black People Grieve.com, an examination of Black grief and commemorative practices in a digital context. So death is a part of the human experience, and individuals will at some point in their lives experience some kind of loss. So finding ways to cope will be necessary. Cultural rituals and practices vary and are shaped by religion, race, gender, nationality, and class. Prior to the internet, death and grief happen based on proximity to the deceased, as well as the bereaved, with obituaries being posted in newspaper articles and deaths being announced on radio, as well as television. However, the internet has expanded our understanding of grief practices and expanded the process of these rituals and cultural practices, which brought me to my research topic. Anderson wrote that the internet has shifted the ways people experience dying, and Willis and Ferrucci followed by stating that the internet has shifted how the bereaved cope with death. According to Kania Landham, media communication technologies and social media have contributed to the expansion of death and mourning. My study seeks to extend the scholarship on death, grief, and digital practices by taking a critical look at Black people and how social media platforms have impacted their grief and mourning practices. So just to look at some of the literature that's already been written, in 1997, Sofka wrote about Thana technology, which is technology that provides support for folks who are experiencing grief or loss or are in the process of processing grief. So it's computer-assisted technologies. But even at the time when Sofka was writing about this, they mentioned the use of VHS tapes, if anybody remembers those, being tapes that could be checked out from libraries, but even also so funeral homes that talked about grieving processes. In 2010, Sanderson and Chong looked at fans grieving celebrity deaths, particularly in the case of Michael Jackson, who was one of the first celebrities who was grieved online on social media platforms, particularly because his death happened a little after Facebook and not too long after Twitter inception. In 2012, Boss and Carnes followed Pigerson and Jacobs and talked about cultural expectations around communicating grief. And their focus was really on things that were happening in real life. So Lingle came in 2013 and talked about online grief practices and how folks were using social media apps to grieve, but more specifically, Facebook. In 2018, Wagner followed and talked about there being appropriate and inappropriate etiquette for sharing and reacting to death online. And then finally, Moyer and Inc. in 2018 talked about some of the affordances and limitations of social networking policies for bereaved users. While doing this research initially and reviewing the literature, what I found was because death is something that is universalizable, it is something that scholars talk about specifically looking at the dominant group, so looking at white folks. And so a lot of the research, it's not a lot of research, but the majority of it is specifically focused on white people and their grieving practices as opposed to other demographics, which brought me to my research question. How have communication, information technologies, and social media impacted the grief and mourning practices of Black people? And I want to say that I came to this question particularly because since 2018, I've experienced a lot of loss, and I think that just comes with age, but I've seen a lot of it happening online, and I wanted to think more about how are we using these technologies and how are they mediating our cultural practices that have constantly happened in real life. So for my method, I ended up doing a collective case study, which Cresswell and Poth talk about in 2018. Collective case study allows for you to pull from multiple documents, artifacts, and other qualitative methods in order to collect data. Because this project would be so extensive, I needed to consult multiple sources in order to come up with an understanding of how communication technologies were mediating grief practices of Black people. I did both an observation and interviews. And in order to do my interviews, I had to consult with my professor at the time. And what we talked about was some of the ethical concerns of trying to reach out to folks who might be posting about grieving or experiencing a loss on time. And so I made the decision to instead do convenience sampling and reach out to individuals who I knew had experienced a loss or used the internet to grieve and spoke with them about their experiences in order to gain more knowledge on the particular topic. This brings me to some of my preliminary findings. The first thing that I found was that Facebook is the preferred social networking site for digital mourning practices, and particularly because Facebook is the app that a lot of people they're actually friends with people in real life. And so there tends to be more personal things being posted around loss and grief or a death in the family. So Facebook is the preferred social networking sites for digital mourning practices. The other finding that I came to was unspoken rules. So one of my participants said in their interview, it's certain things that you don't post out of respect. And when they were talking about this, they particularly noted that when someone passes away, they do not post anything about it until a family member of the relative posts, or excuse me, a family member of the deceased posts about it. Because according to this participant, Facebook has a feature that keeps memories. And the participant said some people might not want to have that memory appear on their feed. So posting on their wall or posting about someone who's deceased might not be a good idea. And I appreciated the participant saying that, but it made me realize that there are a lot of rules to this process that aren't written anywhere, that are not necessarily spoken to, but there are these expectations that people are following them. My other finding was funeral home websites, and more specifically, that we can view funeral home websites as social media platforms. Funeral home websites have significantly expanded the sources that they provide. They have Thana technology, so there are resources there on websites where you can learn about grieving. Some of them are divided by age and demographic. So there were some things that said how to talk about death with your child, how to talk about or how to go through the stages of grief. Other elements of funeral home websites include the obituaries of the deceased that will have a picture, their year, and if you go to their page, the page can include a slideshow with multiple pictures, video clips, and as of the last 4 or 5 years, you can now stream funeral services from funeral home websites directly. You don't necessarily have to be there in person, but you can go on the website now and see the funeral while it's happening live. Now, these features they differ from each website, and they're dependent on the deceased's wishes or the bereaved's wishes. So some of the streaming services will remain on the page for folks to be able to go back and look at them. Some of them only make it available for the service, and then other folks opt not to have services streamed at all. Moving into my discussion. So what does all of this mean? One of the things that became very apparent when interacting with my participants was that when grieving online, Black people tend to be a bit performative. For this one participant, they said that folks want to move very fast and they want to be able to share the information very quickly. They want to prove that they have it hot off the press. But as someone who's watching this and being judgmental of folks who are sharing their grief, you don't even know them like that, was what was said. You don't have a relationship with them. So these behaviors are being watched and being considered as performative or overreactionary for folks who are grieving. The other thing was that communication technologies have made grieving more convenient. Like I was just talking about with funeral home websites, you can, as my participant said, you can type a message on a page and not ever interact with the bereaved. So you can go to the website, you can order flowers, plants, you can type your memory, you can put an emblem with it, and you never have to go and interact with anyone. So while it can be convenient, because some folks can't take off of work, they can't go anywhere, it does make for a less personable experience. And then finally, communal grief and commemoration are what is happening online for Black people. They are able to connect with each other, connect with multiple people who are experiencing the same loss, share memories and other resources. So some future directions for this project. My time as a graduate scholar of the DISCO Network and as a fellow of the BCAT Lab has really made me think more about this project that I began over a year ago. So I'm now thinking about the work of Dr. Tanya Sutherland, whose book, Resurrecting the Black Body, was released in October of 2023, where she talks about Black mourning and death care practices, and specifically the roles of Black memory workers in loss and grief. So if I continue forward with this project, I want to be thinking more specifically about these two things that Sutherland brings up in her text, with thinking about how Black people are grieving together and individually online. The other thing I'm thinking about for future is an expansion of social media platforms and internet sites being used by the bereaved. So Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and even GoFundMe, because I think that has also been a part of some people's grieving process, especially if they have to crowdfund to raise money for the deceased if there's an unexpected death or they do not have insurance. And finally, my question that was much lengthier last year, but not as focused, has now shifted to how does the internet mediate the grief and commemorative practices of Black people? That is all that I have for you all today. These are my references. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the feedback and some of you all's questions.
This is a fascinating project. And so I'm just going to say a few things really quick, and I will, of course, follow up later. As you say, I don't think funeral homes ever imagined they'd be running social networks for grieving people. So these are completely unintended and in some ways unprepared infrastructures that all of a sudden are handling a kind of traffic and social discourse which they were never designed to handle. So I love the way you are working at this not from a position that grief is a white activity. It seems to be a given, but it is about how there's a kind of design which everybody has to use, but we don't all use them in the same way. So I think the nuance and the interest here is gathering your studies, which you have done, and also explaining in a lot more detail than I think has usually been done about what the norms are about posting certain content. Because the protectiveness of people akin for their own loss can play itself out in digital practice, right? So this question, which I think people in digital journalism have been talking about, what's appropriate to share, has become very personalized. And so I think your methodology, which you're very transparent about, which is amazing, gives some accountability here because you say how you found people, some ways that you interacted with them. I'm thinking as well of your callback to early kind of 90s digital culture with your slide design, talking about a moment during which no one could have ever imagined a funeral online. Right, those two things seem to be completely at war with each other because one is embodied and affective and the other, I think, was meant to do something else. I think as you move on, the ways that people adapt and create the spaces that they need often with devices that were really intended for a completely different purpose has been the spirit of the tech innovation field, and wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tynesha and Lisa. And next up, we have Pruna Kim from the University of Michigan, who will be presenting Myeokguk ASMR recipes as ritual in the computational present.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay. I'm just going to start the timer just because I think I have it down. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name's Pruna. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a third-year PhD candidate at the University of Michigan American Culture Program. I work with Dr. Lisa Nakamura in her Digital Inequality Lab, and I just want to do a special thank you to everyone who's here, especially Cherise and Juan, who's making this possible. So thank you, and also to my fellow DISCO scholars. So today I'm going to talk to you about an ongoing project that I'm working on called Myeokguk ASMR. This project is in some ways situated within my broader research interests as a critical food scholar and exploring how food is taken up by BIPOC communities as a means of world building and alternative relationalities. But I'm still figuring out how it fits. So if you have any feedback on how I can tie in this more creative experiment to my dissertation, that would be amazing. Okay, Myeokguk ASMR is the first iteration at a series that experiments with the form of recipe as ritual. The aim of this project is to see what sociopolitical possibilities open up when we turn to the repetitive but always different motions of ritual in our computational present. If digital capitalism is predicated on prediction, where does ritual take us? Drawing from Romy Ron Morrison and Lauren Braden's attention to ritual over prediction, which I will touch on in a bit, I wanted to know what happens when we position recipes as a practice of ritual. So I was especially interested in playing around with the genre of recipe, mostly because I was noticing how much recipe was being taken up as a predictive practice, right? And most importantly, we keep talking about recipe as a way to really think about and teach code and algorithm. And so the key assumption with both recipes and algorithm is that the better they are at getting you to the desired outcome, the better they are as a recipe or algorithm, right? And so the attention within this framing is really paid to the product, which the desired outcome, which inherently will value, and we actually fail to account for and value all of the excess that exists along with it, like the movements or the encounters, intentions, affect, and relationalities that occur also as well. So I wanted my project to really play on this assumption and really trouble it and ask after the possibilities of when we reorient our understanding of recipes entirely differently, where do we land? As I mentioned, this project really builds on Romy Ron Morrison and Lauren Braden's brilliant emphasis on ritual and digital capitalism. In their article, How Can You Spell Care with Ones and Zeros? Morrison and Braden explores the real possibilities of care in our computational present. For both authors, the underlying injury of our computational present is the violent foreclosure of life chances via computational practices of categorization, measurement, exploitation, processes that are all optimized through prediction. So in response, they speak on the importance of habit and rituals in the everyday as a means for us to get to moments of emergence, of some form of spiraling arrival that allows us to get closer to different life-giving possibilities and worlds. What is also notable in their piece is that they give a lot of weight to acts of noticing and paying attention in the everyday as a part to build up rituals that help us better prepare ourselves in moving through this world together and reposition taking on shared risk as a sacred relational practice. So I really love the provocations that Morrison and Britton offered us in this piece and decided to explore the socio-political possibilities of ritual and recipe by making an experimental recipe for miyeokguk. So I'm gonna play a little bit of the ASMR right now.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Can you all hear that? Okay, perfect. So while we listen to the recipe, so I decided to choose miyeokguk because I was really noticing that I was spending a lot of time cooking it for myself and for others, especially during the pandemic, but also since I got diagnosed with fibromyalgia and a lot of my chronic pain conditions. And so I wanted this project to account for all the time and body movements and intentions that really surface up for me whenever I cook this soup for my chronically sick body or those I love. So for context, if you haven't had the pleasure of trying miyeokguk directly translated is seaweed or kelp soup, and it's also known as birthday soup, and it's this beautiful Korean soup that a lot of Koreans will eat during their birthdays. And we eat this during our birthdays because our ommas, or the parent who birthed us, were fed this soup when we were born as a way to replenish good blood and postpartum health. And it's said that we know that kelp is good for postpartum health because we actually observed this from whales who eat a lot of kelp after having babies. And I really love this ritual that we have because a big part of eating miyeokguk on your birthday is really a really good example of how food ritualizes and manifests our kind of interdependence and how we live as collective selves. And so I thought miyeokguk would be a really great kind of recipe to play around when thinking about recipes as rituals. So as you can tell, the recipe is really ineffective as a recipe. It's really a mix of a lot of the sounds that I make when I'm making miyeokguk. And so a huge part of this project is inviting participants, artists, and other people to engage with it as a recipe and see what happens and where they land. And I was able to do this actually with two of my dear friends, Raquel and Lise, who were also disco fellows at the Haystack conference last year, where we actually built a making workshop that kind of thought through the importance of play and relationality in digital capitalism, but really invited the participants to engage with this recipe by giving them crafting materials. So you can see some of the images of some of the miyeokguk that our participants had made, and we were able to reflect on and meditate on what that felt like for us. And so for next steps of this project over the summer, I'm hoping to engage with other artists as well as do a few more of these workshops to think through the sociopolitical possibilities of recipes as rituals, and then build towards an exhibit or some form of documentation that kind of answers the questions that kind of informed this project in the first place. And in terms of my future research, as I had mentioned before, in some ways, I think this project really fits into my broader research interests as thinking about food as a world building strategy for BIPOC communities. But I'm still figuring out how to do that, how to weave this project in. So if you have any feedback or insight, I would love that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Oh, do I shop? Okay.
Hi, Purna. This is Remy speaking.
I'm so happy because I read this piece in your class.
This is just so amazing, and also just seeing where it's taken off since that class. And I'll send a follow-up email afterwards since we're so short on time, but just a couple of quick thoughts. I really love the direction this took you in terms of thinking about the pedagogical implications of framing recipes as algorithms or algorithms as recipes. And also what you were noting about excess, like there's something really compelling here about the notion of the superfluous and how that connects with the relational, but also how it connects with time. So what is the time of cooking? What is the time of family? What is the time of fibro? Like, it seems like there's a lot of potential connections between Korean cooking crib time, as well as connections between, I'm thinking about actually the project for class and the complexities of audience, for example, and what does it mean to think about recipes as part of the sacred, as part of kinship networks that don't need to be shared beyond, versus like how we think about internet recipes as being somehow connected to this notion of broader opening. So what does it mean to value the closedness as well? And then just one last thought here in terms of what you were noting about trying to think through how would this flow into a dissertation. I can so imagine the dissertation being a recipe unto itself. And what are the potentialities of a dissertation project as being ASMR-like? What are the possibilities of having those multimodal elements? Because the library can do it. You can have audio accompaniments, and just the soundscape of this was just totally amazing. So I will stop. Lisa, I don't know if there's time or if you have a thought, but those are my quick reactions.
Yeah, and Prune and I talk other times, so I'm just going to say really quickly, this brings so much to mind about the history of early computing and cooking, because one of the first computers that was available for home purchase was a Honeywell kitchen computer, which cost $10,000. It was sold at Neiman Marcus. Hardly anybody bought it. But originally, I think home computers were meant to do things like organize recipes. So I think it was like Norbert Wiener or somebody early, Alan Kay, who was asked, what would we do if we could use computers in the home? And they were like, in the home. First of all, that's women's space. Secondly, maybe they could keep track of recipes. So I think there's a rich archive of thinking about the home and what computers might do there, and also the role of women as executing the recipe. So if the software is the code, the computer is the executor of the code, right? It follows the directions. And so there's some interesting friction between who executes and who writes, right? Who produces. So yeah, very cool. Thank you very much.
Amazing, Pruna. And just moving right along, the next speaker is Elise Nagy, who will be presenting The Arms Are As Long as Printed Exclamation Marks, Women's Health DIY Print Cultures, 1970 to 2016. And Elise is also from the University of Michigan.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. And I also just wanted to say, Juan, I do that every time I try to say exclamation points when I read this phrase. So exclamation parks is exactly what happens for me. So yes, I'm Elise Nagy. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, and I'm part of the Digital Accessible Futures Lab as part of the DISCO network. And the lab is directed by Remy Yurgo. And today I'm talking about women's health DIY print cultures and sort of print and digital media. Content warnings, especially if we have time to get into the text that I'm adding to the end of this presentation more, they will involve talking about infertility, conception, embryonic and fetal development, references to trans antagonism, some sexually explicit language, and mentions of genocide. This is part of my larger dissertation project, which looks at undergraduate women's health education in the US and how it both reproduces and resists hegemonic ideologies of health, fat embodiment, gender and sex, race, sexuality, and disability. And a sort of ongoing question that I'm thinking with here is that in feminist and women's health knowledge cultures, which I use as an umbrella term to talk about the entwined activist and academic spaces that deal with women's health. So in those spaces for the past 50 plus years, an ongoing question has been, how do we grapple with and circumscribe the category of women? And in thinking with that question, I argue that in our current moment, transfeminist and disability justice-oriented activism and knowledge building about embodiment, power, and health thoroughly manifests the spirit of the women's health movement as it emerged in the late 1960s. So rather than being a distraction or derailment or pivot or whatever, I'm saying that this is actually like very much aligned with the core of what this movement started out as. So part of making that argument includes wanting to surface and highlight the relationship between current and recent transfeminist and disability justice-oriented digital media and some of the print media that was created in the context of the women's health movement in the early 1970s. And of course, digital and print are not really like, that's a false dichotomy, and we can get into that, but it's looking at these two different kinds of media in this very specific context. So the question that this presentation poses is, how does the digital construction and circulation of texts that reflect and build women's health knowledge relate to a lineage of print-based women's health knowledge building? And to speak towards that question, three texts that I'm gesturing towards are Women and Their Bodies, A Course, which is a book that was later retitled in 1973, Our Bodies Ourselves. This version that I'm looking at was published in 1970. I'm looking at the zine titled Fucking Trans Women, issue number 0, which was published by Mira Bellwether in 2010. And then also the Hybrid and Poetry BioArt project by Misha Cardenas, titled Pregnancy, Reproductive Futures in Trans of Color Feminism, which was published in TSQ in 2016. When I argue that current or recent transfeminist and disability justice-oriented activism and knowledge building manifests the spirit of the women's health movement as it emerged in the late 60s, what does that really mean? What does it mean to thoroughly manifest that spirit? And what is that spirit? Across these three texts, I understand that to mean an epistemological shift towards valuing and insisting on politicized, collective, reflexive, and materially embodied subjectivities, which kind of, in a very simplified way, part of it can be understood as learning about our bodies with and through and in our bodies. This also means problematizing mind-body dualism and biological determinism, highlighting the provisional and partial and in-progress nature of knowledge building, and expressing an intention to invite collaboration and variation and multiplicity and coalition, with a sort of asterisk in terms of whether that intention is always actually borne out in practice effectively. I argue that it isn't. This sort of spirit also includes the spirit of DIY culture, particularly in terms of research and care protocols. So thinking with Michelle Murphy's work there on the women's health movement as protocol feminism, and also DIY culture in terms of making media with visual and textual elements that are often appropriated from elsewhere and repurposed. And then finally, this spirit involves being replete with paradox, that anywhere you look in women's health knowledge cultures, paradoxes pop up. And one of those paradoxes is that you find often a playfulness in these spaces that is specifically enabled by technological affordances and constraints within tense and high stakes contexts. So some of those tense and high stakes contexts include both pre and post nationwide protections, at least on paper, of abortion care access in the US. The first text that I'm looking at, published obviously in 1970, was pre-Roe v. Wade. These contexts also include being in community and collectives with intense affective dimensions and power differentials. These contexts include the current nationwide hypervisibility of trans antagonism in the US, and also just the personal stakes of being in a body and wanting to do or avoid certain things with and within it. So whether that's having sex or conception or pregnancy or birth, the tip of the iceberg, but that's what the three texts that I'm looking at today all deal with and center on. I keep trying to forward with the wrong button. For the sake of time, the rest of my slides are going to be quick glances and gestures towards these three texts to see some of their visual similarities, but I ask that you please not expect to be able to read all of the text-heavy slides from here on out. This is mostly to just give you a sense of what they are, and I highly recommend reading each of them in their entirety later. So the first text that I want to talk about is this, and I thought it would be helpful to show just how DIY this first version of Our Bodies Ourselves is. Obviously, you can see it's handwritten, and the title of my talk today comes from this part in the appendix of this text that addresses the growth of the embryo fetus from week to week. And we can see it's in the third sort of paragraph here in the longer screenshot, where it's talking about the 7th week of embryonic development. It says, 7th week, embryo 1 inch long, weighs 1/30 of an ounce. The stomach produces digestive juices, the liver makes blood cells, and the kidneys have started to extract uric acid from the blood. The ears develop in unison, timing, and form, as do the arms and legs. The upper and lower jaws are clear, the mouth has lips, a sort of tongue, and first teeth, buds. The arms are as long as printed exclamation marks. The thumb is different from the fingers, etc. And so looking at how these three texts weave together, one of the things that I'm focusing on is that playfulness that is attached to specific technological affordances, but also constraints. And in this case, the constraint of printing, if we're talking about using a typewriter, being relatively standardized is what allows for this playfulness of saying that the arms of an embryo in the 7th week of development are as long as printed exclamation marks, because we couldn't really do that now. That kind of playfulness, we would have to take a different tack, because printed exclamation marks can be all kinds of sizes. So just looking at these three texts, there are a lot of instances like this where the technology used to create the texts allows for playfulness in a way that is very situated and bounded to a particular time and place and set of technological possibilities. So the second text that I'm looking at is this zine, Fucking Trans Women, and I included a picture of the author because Mira Bellwether, so this is going to be hard for me to talk about. I didn't know her personally, but she passed away a couple of years ago, and she identified as a femme trans dyke and talked a lot and wrote a lot about what it meant to show up visually in the world and how she took pleasure in showing up visually in the world. And so I wanted to include her image here. It's her Twitter profile picture. And in this text, some of the instances, and I just realized I'm over time, of playfulness can be seen here in talking about, in the second arrow on this page, it points to a phrase that said, "Here there be dragons and sea monsters, my fellow genital cartographers, and we have a lot to learn from poking them." So playfulness like that. Again, I suggest reading this text in its entirety. It's great. And the third text that I'm looking at is Pregnancy by Misha Cardenas. And again, just to give a sense of how the visual textual things are working together here. She, in this hybrid bioart poem, says, "We will fight back against these genocidal projects by making life, family, love, and joy, by making babies with our queer trans bodies." And she uses stills from a video of, here, let me move to the next slide. Here she says, "Other trans women taught me how to do it. Sadie said, get a microscope. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for doctor visits to check your semen. With a $50 kid's microscope, you can see sperm, morphology, and motility. I did, I can, and I do." So these images that are part of the bioart poem are from that telescope. And again, just quick gestures towards text that I'm thinking with while posing the question of how the digital construction and circulation of texts that reflect and build women's health knowledge relate to a lineage of print-based women's health knowledge building like that from 1970 and from very early on in what's considered a very classic and central moment of the 20th century women's health movement. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
I believe it's time my turn to jump in. Elise, thank you for such a wonderful, if not short, snapshot of your work. And so some of the things that came out to me in listening to you, I'm excited to hear about your focus on women in women's history. As you probably know better than I do, there's a lot of conversation about what is happening to women's history at this moment and how that is potentially being overshadowed by a lot of other intellectual efforts, but women's history is still important and valuable, and in that arc back to the Boston Women's Health Book Collective is really important. So I like the effort in thinking about the intersectionality of this movement from analog to digital. When we think about typewriters and the creating of women in their bodies / our bodies ourselves, it's a really interesting way to think about that. And part of it, what I think about those moments, and I'm not sure if there's enough of us on the screen who remember actually writing on a typewriter on a regular basis. Lisa raised her hand, thank you. But right, there's a certain sense of deliberateness that you had to have with typewriter writing. And I love that that early versions of Women in Their Bodies was use the typewriter and the effort to, in a sense, not make mistakes. So I like the expressing this creative aspect of it, but there's also a kind of structural, deliberate nature of it. Other thing that I was really excited to hear you bring out is another version of expressions of citizen science. Our bodies of cells is a really important aspect of that, right? So many people situate the emergence of in public discourse of citizen science within Steve Epstein's work, really wonderful work on GRID, HIV, and AIDS. But right, you're harking back to another moment, and the last version you gave us was images of the petri dishes and people using microscopes to test their sperm motility is clearly a powerful expression of citizen science. And right, it's pushing for me, the idea is, so what does it mean to think about science and specifically medicine in the service of humanity, in the service of women? And so how are women at this moment re-articulating their relationship with the medical industrial complex and making powerful interventions in shaping their bodies and existences? And I think that's all I would like to add, because I think we're going to keep us on moving on schedule. But overall, I thought it was really fascinating. I'm really excited just to see this project develop.
Yeah, really amazing work, Elise, and thanks, Ray. So next up, we have from University of Maryland, College Park, Jessica Rucker, who will be presenting Keep It Black, Keep It Brief, and Keep It Online, Lessons from a Pedagogical Influencer.
Thank you so much. My apologies. I thought I was at the bottom of the heap for this round, but I'm up top. So here I come. Give me 1 second, good folks. Thank you so much. So peace, everyone. My name is Jessica A. Rucker, and I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm a graduate scholar in the BCAT lab. I appear in the feed as a Black USian masculine of center lesbian with a multicolor adjustable strap, Obey propaganda hat, clear frame glasses, and I'm wearing a denim Oxford accented by a silver chain. I can be reached at JRUCKER3 and I am she, her in terms of pronouns. Next, I would like to express deep gratitude to Dr. Catherine Knight Steele, my other collaborators at the BCAT lab, to Sharice, Tuan, to the PIs, to the Disco Network, and to attendees, specifically my folks. Thank y'all so much for making time to be here. In 2021, I was still a high school social studies teacher in my home city, Washington, D.C., and I was teaching online. And as a heads up, I'm going to ask you all to engage with me like you are in the chat throughout this presentation. That year, I designed and co-taught a course called Movement for Black Lives 2020, which is a class that I only taught that school year in response to the 2020 uprisings. 2021 was also the year that the state of Missouri led multiple states now to introduce bills that will prohibit teaching classes that identify people or groups of people, entities, institutions in the United States as inherently immutably or systematically sexist, racist, anti-LGBTQ, bigoted, biased, privileged, or oppressed. So essentially, this bill would prohibit teaching classes like what I taught. And now in the United States, fast forward to 2024, Missouri is only one of over 40 states that wants to make teaching courses like mine impossible. So this was vexing in 2021, and it's still actually pretty vexing right now. But serendipitously, on April 16th of 2022, which is also DC Emancipation Day, one of my homegirls texted me 2 IG links to the Parking Lot Pimpin' series. Now, at the time, I wasn't familiar with the series, and I watched the 2 links that she provided for me. And let me check in with the chat real quick. If you're familiar with the series, can you use the chat to let me know? And for bonus points, if you can name a topic or an episode that you remember, that would be super cool for me to see. And I'll keep going as the chat starts to populate with those topics. But anyway, I was immediately intrigued by the content, the ideas, word choice, gestures, mannerisms, the quality of the production, the fact that I was actually able to watch these Instagram links that my friend shared with me, despite the fact that I don't have an Instagram account, and I'm still fascinated and still intrigued. It's been 2 years since I was first introduced to the Parking Lot Pimpin' series. And I find the series still very compelling, and I've taken it on as an object of inquiry. And over the course of our fellowship, my research questions have evolved, and I'm now asking this particular question as my kind of dominant question. How does the Parking Lot Pimpin' series form a digital critical pedagogy? Lene Vinay Boggs, the series creator, locates Black people as already online, as learners, as skilled users, content creators, publics, and even as consumers. Rather than solely analyzing the content of the Parking Lot Pimpin' series videos, I conduct a critical technocultural discourse analysis, the critical research method coined by our very own Dr. Andre Brock of Parking Lot Pimpin'. And through my research, I argue that Parking Lot Pimpin' draws on Black histories, Black cultural practices, and Black intellectual traditions to teach audiences to think critically and capaciously about our democracy, about schools as state-sanctioned institutions, and schools also as institutions currently under attack and being sanctioned by the state, and alternative modes for truth-telling beyond brick-and-mortar classrooms. I've also learned that the platforms and interfaces where Parking Lot Pimpin' is housed both help and hinder the formation of the series as a critical pedagogy. I put my CTDA in conversation with various other critical theories and critical theorists through the frameworks of the Black radical tradition, digital Black feminism, Black feminist technoculture, Black technophilia, Black vernacular technological creativity. So shout outs to Dr. Steele and Dr. Fouché, Black oral culture and signifying, digital griots, the new oratory, oscillating network publics, and even Dr. Tanya Sutherland's critical refusal. So I build on this existing scholarship by emphasizing Boggs's centering of Black people, Black language, Black mannerisms, and Black life. And I acknowledge that her approach to teaching and learning is also evidence of Black technophilia, or Black people's long relationship and dexterous handling of digital technologies, and by revealing new economic avenues of legitimacy that Black educators like her can pursue as pedagogical influencers, which is a term that I've been thinking through. So before I get into potential Black futures for this project, thank you all for lighting up the chat. I just want to see, so some people love the series. Okay, great. I just want to see if anybody named any specific things, but that's all right. I'm gonna encourage you all to check out the series. The future of this work. Parking Lot Pimpin' proves that teaching and learning are not solely reserved for the academy, nor the analog world, and that information circulation is not solely reserved for the mass media. In fact, teaching is the responsibility of teachers, and information sharing is the responsibility of the informed. Boggs is a teacher armed with information about Black life, digital tools, digital platforms, and knowledge of their affordances. And she proves that by mobilizing digital technologies via digital platforms, education and learning about Black life, namely Black histories in the present, had the capacity to transcend location and place while simultaneously creating new online industries. Therefore, in the future, I hope to build out 2 new analytics that have surfaced since beginning the research for this project. One is a concept that I like to call a pedagogical influencer, and I'm happy at some other time to talk through my thinking with that. And then the other is the concept of a digital Black feminist critical pedagogy. So I'll pause here and express my gratitude. Thank you so much again for folks who were invited and are attending, to our PIs and to my fellow graduate scholars. This has been a super instructive fellowship.
Thank you so much. I have so much to say about this presentation. It strikes me that the delegitimation of knowledge produced by and about women and people of color, which we saw in Elise's talk, shows how new forms of mediation, and in her case, like calligraphy, but in yours, like Instagram, are part of a way to pass on an oral tradition, which has now become a radical tradition, but what used to just be called knowledge. So I'm very interested in the illicitness of what we know to be knowledge, and how reclaiming it through social forms. And in a lot of ways, calligraphy is a social form too. Like, you imagine the hand that was making it wasn't a machine. And there's so much to say here about the circulation of wisdom through these modes and places where you don't expect it. As we were saying, or as Tanisha was saying, I don't think legacy.com ever thought they were going to be the Facebook of mourning. And likewise, I'm not sure Instagram ever thought it was going to be the higher education or it was going to be the social studies class of kids that age. But people use the tools that they have to use or that come close to hand. And so I would love to see more sometime about how groups like the Black Panthers used other media when they were also shut out from legitimated forms of distribution to get their message out, the way they created alternative kinds of places. So I think Oliver Nelson's written on the Black Panthers and their use of their own mutual aid and medical infrastructure because of lack of access to hospitals. So fascinating, such a tradition of Black history and resistance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Remy had to stop for a minute. Who is the next?
So I think right now we have a little bit of time in the schedule for a 5-minute screen break. We've been going through a lot of really wonderful presentations. So maybe we'll come back a little after 5:20. And if you want to take a body break, that'll be great. All right, so kicking off our second half of presenters, we have from the University of Michigan, Pratiksha Thangamenon, who will be presenting Banbury Retold, Rewriting Popular Memory Through Islamophobic Horror.
Hi, everyone. Following up after Jessica's amazing presentation, that's going to be one tough act. Before I begin my talk formally, I would like to add that you will find the access copy for this talk in the chat. This access copy contains the textual description of the images and some context for the images that I'm going to be sharing during this presentation. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around. I'm Pratiksha, and my presentation titled Babri Retold, Rewriting Popular Memory Through Islamophobic Humor is excerpted from a dissertation chapter which examines how the online circulation of Islamophobic humor mainstreams Hindutva supremacy. Hindutva is a socio-political ideology that aims at mutating India into a Hindu theocratic state. So my work argues that the practices of antagonistic humor online demonstrate how the affective frame around the 1992 demolition of the Babri Mosque has shifted from one of shame to one of schadenfreude, thus rewriting popular memory of the incident and contributing to the historical revisionist narratives that fulfill the ethno-nationalist fictions of Hindutva. I propose that righteous schadenfreude, specifically laughter at the misfortune of the other, in this case, the figure of the Indian Muslim, is the dominant affect simultaneously propelling and generated by the online circulation of antagonistic humor. The Hindu nationalist narrative for undertaking the destruction of the Babri Mosque in a nutshell goes something like this. The mosque was supposedly built over the birthplace of Hindu deity Lord Ram, so this wrongdoing had to be avenged by bringing down the mosque and building a temple dedicated to Lord Ram on that very spot. This illegal demolition by Hindu vigilantes was followed by communal riots in various parts of the country, leading to over 1,200 deaths, mostly Muslim, houses razed to the ground, shops burned down, changing the social fabric of the country forever. These were some of the article headlines from mainstream English language media expressing a collective sense of shame at what happened. The letters to the editor reflected a conviction that this was wrong and not becoming of a secular nation that prided itself on religious tolerance. 27 years later, in November 2019, the Supreme Court decided that the land on which the Babri Masjid was built would be handed over to the Hindu Temple Board. And a year later, on September 2020, all of those accused of the demolition were acquitted. In the middle of these two verdicts, the foundation stone for the Ram Temple was laid in August 2020. I will now share with you some of the humorous memes that were circulating on Twitter and Instagram and social media in general when the 2019 and 2020 verdicts took place. The comic formula in this image lies in the incongruous juxtaposition of the image of the demolition with the phrase, "our boys played well," which is a term used in the game of cricket to refer to the players of one's own team. Unlike other spheres that signify global importance like Hollywood or the Olympics, where India is a negligible entity, commercial cricket is actually one global arena in which India occupies a premier position. This makes cricket an important marker of Indian identity and national pride that provides international validation. The expression of schadenfreude is also an accepted ritual of sports spectatorship, and there is a slippage in that schadenfreude allows for between playful, "oh, it's just a game," and adversarial, "we must play to win." And that is what allows for the negative and positive affects to coexist comfortably. By placing this demolition within the affective paradigms of a sport, the laughter and pleasure at this unfortunate incident can be easily accommodated by drawing on the normative expectations of sports spectatorship, thus absolving the participants from expectations of shame. Moreover, by comparing the demolition process to a sport through the generic conventions of online humor, the schadenfreude expressed over the demolition is not merely deemed acceptable, but is arguably one of the most pleasurable components of being a player or a spectator. By reducing this demolition to a sporting event, the material destruction, and the widespread terror that this event caused is effectively erased. The emphasis on our boys, strategically placed for the effect of humorous incongruity, illustrates a sense of ownership, belonging, and fraternity. This valorization of toxic masculinity through pride in a collective act of violence, construed as a righteous act of revenge, heightens the Schadenfreude experienced by the meme's sympathetic viewers. The sense of collective Schadenfreude experienced at conquering the other and the pleasure of fraternalism experienced in the circulation of this joke functions to unify the sympathetic viewing public through the collective exhilaration of cheering on our boys and the collective laughter at both the incongruities of the joke and the shared understanding of the intertextual polysemy of this meme. The stickiness of Schadenfreude thus becomes one of the affective forces binding this community, further contributing to the endurance of the Hindutva narrative in which the demolition is a matter of pride. In this revisioning of events, this narrative constructs a moment of historical unity where previously there were tense expressions of shame, shock, and guilt. Now, within Hindutva discourses, the figure of the Muslim simultaneously functions as a threat to be conquered as well as an infant to be disciplined. Humor is the ideal genre for reconciling contradictory assertions because the basic format requires an element of incongruity to succeed. The discursive construction of Schadenfreude here relies heavily on the axiomatic notion that children do not know what is best for them. Hence, parents have to make decisions for their children's benefit that they may not always be pleased with, understand, or appreciate. The Schadenfreude is thus perceived as benign since the child's wishes are ostensibly dismissed for their own benefit. The child's cuteness is also an object of laughter, which further legitimizes the Schadenfreude as harmless. The incongruity of this humorous analogy situates the Hindutva mobs in a paternalistic position relative to Babri as the stubborn child, thus infantilizing the Muslim other. Through the use of this analogy, the Muslim other is depicted as one that needs to be disciplined for their own good. Echoing the colonial rhetorics of infantilizing conquered populations, Hindutva here deploys the infantilization rhetoric as a justification for control and discipline of its Muslim population. So now the humor in this meme softens the call for another demolition implied in the phrase, the reunion we want. The humorous form prevents the content from being censored, allowing the implicit calls to violence to keep circulating. The memorializing of this demolition as an act not only worth repeating, but hotly desired by its fans, analogous to the Friends reunion, adds to its memorialization as an enjoyable event for those who participated. Memes that foster comparisons to popular culture artifacts such as Friends detach the narrative of Babri from its historical and socio-political context. The comedic simplification of the demolition substitutes the collective moral questioning that took place immediately after the demolition with a linear narrative of inevitability that overlooks the orchestrated nature of the attack. Humor here performs the work of depoliticizing the state agenda, making Babri appear like an outcome of democratic public opinion, when in fact it was an act of politically motivated violence instigated by the powerful individuals it served. The allowances of online humor make this sort of trivialization and decontextualization possible because the use of memes as a medium diminishes the importance of whether the claim being made by the meme is factually accurate, releasing it from any obligation to rational critical claims and instead prioritizing its ability to fit into existing schemas of genre and representation. But that's all I have today. Thank you for sticking around. I welcome any questions and comments on my work.
Thank you so much. This is amazing. I'm so glad I get just a minute or two to respond. I'm really taken by this idea of not only humor as Schadenfreude, which I think you talk about so well, but the layered complexity of utilizing this to move in what is seemingly a popularized linear fashion from shame to Schadenfreude as a mechanism to ignore or obfuscate responsibility, accountability, and the complexity of harms that are done within groups, within communities. I think we read and we have read a good amount about the movement from folks even on our RPI list about the movement to thinking about how groups use pleasurable, humor, joyful mechanisms as modes of resistance, but we must always also keep in mind the way that those can be taken back up by groups to do continued harm back to communities as well. I really like this idea of the slippage between playfulness and adversary and how your work helps us break down these bifurcations and binaries that are often found in the way that particularly, I would say, Western scholars tend to think about norms of opposites of playfulness and harm, of humor and pain, of pleasure and hurts and violences. And I think your work does such a lovely job of breaking down those kinds of binaries and reminding us of the actual importance, even in a system of thinking about digital culture on global scale, to do localized, critically, culturally specific work that actually recognizes the need to understand how humor functions differently for different audiences at different moments, even though we can extrapolate ideas about it for other folks as well. So I don't want to take up too much time, but this was just lovely and really quite compelling, and I think will be taken up by quite a lot of folks who are thinking about, even those of us who are trying to push back against the idea that everything online is resistant, right? That humor also and pleasure itself is worthy of our critical lens, even when it kind of contradicts some of the things that we want to push for in terms of joy and pleasure online. So thank you so much for that challenge, and I really appreciated the work.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Pratiksha and Catherine. And next up, we have Jasmine Banks, who's presenting Black digital culture and the right to opacity.
Hello, everyone. Can y'all hear me? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm assuming the answer is yes. Okay. Second. Okay. Hold on. So sorry. Okay. I can't really, can you guys see my screen? Yeah. Okay, cool. I couldn't tell. Cool. Well, good afternoon. Hello, everybody. My name is Jasmine Banks. I'm currently a PhD candidate in psychology and digital studies at the University of Michigan. And today I'm really excited to share with you this project entitled If Black Digital Culture and the Right to Opacity. This is a project that I really love and have worked on for the majority of my grad career after doing a pretty solid career shift within the field of psychology. And this is a piece that I've had the wonderful opportunity to work with some brilliant folks, Eden Harrison and Pierre Steth on, and it couldn't be done without them. So the central question of this project that we asked is, what is this Black and Black digital culture? So in this, we're referencing the work of Stuart Hall that provides us a crucial departure point to examining Black culture today concerning the intersections of technology and Blackness. And this is something I wanted to understand through the lens of Black users themselves. So as such, I conducted 5 focus groups with 19 Black young adults to engage in discussions about their experience of being Black and online. And to our jumping off point question across our groups of what is Black digital culture, I heard participants share many anecdotal responses. They describe components of the digital, of hashtags, of different websites, past and new, and various chronically online lore. And unsurprisingly, most referred to Black Twitter, where they describe the use of memes, humor, with few participants describing it as a collective joke, and Cassidy arguing that the Black side of Twitter, basically where Black people share their experiences and jokes, and it feels familiar. So within these, we hear something familiar. We hear a sense of we within the space of Black Twitter. And I wanted to understand more specifically how Black users are locating and defining these spaces. So when I probed a bit farther about what really makes up Black Twitter, I saw users really struggle or even at times refuse to define what Black digital culture is. But they did provide more context. And Jaden, after frustratingly trying to figure out how to answer this, lands at it's a type of thing, whether it's something that just happened and people are making light of it, or it's something people are speaking about on a day-to-day, or just things that happen on a regular. It provides community. And Mary, similarly, in a different group, argues that I think people try to understand it from the outside, but there's language and context and things that are used that if you aren't a part of the Black community, you don't really get. And this This is summarized really well through Ace's line of questioning where he says, a Black meme, right? What is this Black in front of meme? Is that a noun? Is that an adjective? What exactly it is, I don't know. But a Black meme, I suppose there's something in it that helps me connect. And these responses and discourse illustrates our participants' attempt to explain what they think Black digital culture is. However, there was a consensus that there's just a sentiment of knowing something is Black. Oftentimes, after discussing, they ended on the ability to just know and to recognize something that is familiar. And altogether, I heard participants that really seemed to be hesitant to define this, but the if approach suggested a shared understanding that doesn't have to be explicitly described or explained. And the fact that there's just a sense of understanding that you can recognize the Blackness that lies within a piece of artifact and know that others who share the same identity as you also are experiencing it in the same way without needing additional explanation. And simply put, there is an understanding that what's understood don't got to be explained. And this is especially interesting because from existing research and emerging research, we've learned a lot about the ways that Black users and Black people engage in digital spaces to retell their own stories, to create new subjectivities or new ways of seeing themselves online, and to challenge a limited view of the white gaze. But something else we also know is that in these spaces, Black users are engaging in varying levels of refusal of legibility or creating a barrier to understanding that may be necessary. So through the screenshots of the tweets on the screen, they give light to some of the reasons why Black users engage in this, whether it's due to cultural appropriation, Black fishing, using AAVV out of context, or without the proper understanding. These are the type of things that's happening on the front end. And another way that users engage in this refusal of legibility is through the strategic use of ambiguity through coded language, linguistics and cultural nuances, signifying, and what I come to understand by way of Jessica Marie Johnson as the ways that Black people hack their ways into the system. And within this context of what that we're speaking of through these groups, a lot of times we see participants referencing things that are deeply embedded with Black culture, within Black culture, not immediately accessible or understandable by outsiders. And this is another quote from participant Sam that describes this really well. And she says, Black digital culture offers a space for Black people where Black people could just be, whether it's based on the language that we develop and use on the internet or something else. There are spaces that we can just exist, be ourselves momentarily before it's stolen, taken, or Columbused, if you will. And this is where I turn to Glissant and his concept of opacity, or a unknowability and the alterity that is unquantifiable. He introduced this concept to critique Western obsession with transparency and knowability, and he demands the right for opacity for all and the ability for people to engage in acts of opacity, especially for the ways that it functions as a stance against conquest, domination, and the white gaze. So putting this in the context of the participant Sam that we just heard from, Black digital cultures oftentimes gets Columbus or appropriated, illustrating why opacity or the unknowability can be a really critical tool for Black users to draw on. However, with the fast pace of the internet and technologies changing, how my strategies of opacity and resistance also need to evolve. So to this end, Zach Blass, artist, furthers the concept of opacity to further examine what he terms informatic opacity as a way to assert agency and invade surveillance, operating as a politics of refusal. And it's necessary because in this age of technological surveillance and the emphasis on quantifying of the self, opacity becomes a protective mechanism. So taken all together, it serves as a politic of refusal in the everyday, and it comes with a level of ambiguity that carries power within it. So here, the challenge is to acknowledge the work of opacity and to work to maintain it as a right for all, even in the context of the digital, as Glissant argues for, especially because opacity can be a strategic choice, one that may be necessary. So how does strategic informatic opacity serve in Black folks' pursuit of liberation, to quote Mr. Dr. Adam Banks himself? So to wrap up, I pose this question for you all. If we're willing to sit with abstraction, what new insights might be revealed to us, and how might it reshape the very questions that we ask and subsequently the answers that we get? Thank you all. Shout out to everybody on the screen, all the homies, and my dog, Toby. Thank you.
Jasmine, thank you so much. Pleasure to listen to your work and hear how your thoughts on this are evolving over time. And I love to sit with that final question. And it's perhaps one of my favorite questions is how, when we restructure and reframe what's at the center of our points of inquiry, might the questions we ask themselves actually change, which I think is the most powerful thing we can do, particularly in these kind of collaborative environments. I hear you talking about a digital culture where early scholars pointed so much to the idea of online spaces benefit being the removal of our identities, right? And the way that we don't have to be ourselves online and how we can move away from these restrictive boundaries. And of course, your work following in the long tradition of saying, actually, no, people want to be themselves in these spaces. And in fact, sometimes we want to be ourselves, but we also want to be left alone, that those two things can coincide is such a lovely, I think, part of your work where you're pointing to the high context for participation that Black users have always utilized as affordances of these varied platforms. A thing that I really love here is this complication of the notion of refusal. I think oftentimes people are thinking about refusal, again, in these kind of either people opt all the way into digital technology or they refuse participation in it. And you're asking for us to think about this in a much more layered, complex, and nuanced way, that there is strategic refusal. There's intentional pieces of ourselves that we'll share and other parts that we will hold back. And that all of that is really bound up in Black users' understanding of the affordances of platforms, how to strategically deploy them at certain moments and then retract that deployment at others. I'm thinking about work on hashtags that was so popular for so long, and then folks intentionally not using hashtags and just beginning conversations based on the existing networks. I'm fascinated to see how this develops across different kinds of platforms, right? Outside of spaces like Twitter, where we've gotten so much robust research on Black Twitter, but how Black folks on other platforms are using this kind of strategic deployment as well. And I also love this notion of opacity as a pushback as well to this rather, I would say, progressive academic idea that transparency is the end all be all of what we should opt for as scholars hoping to do the good work, that everything should be more transparent, our work should be more transparent, our methods, our contexts, our conversations. That is the ultimate mechanism for us to show and demonstrate our collegiality and our accessibility and our desire for folks to get involved. And you're saying, again, complex, layered, nuanced, opacity also is a useful tool and a useful mechanism to combat surveillance and theft and harms in really strategic ways. So I want to thank you for your research project. I think it points us in some really interesting questions, both about digital scholarship, but also about our role as people who lead research teams and the level of transparency that we ask for or that we promote as part of those initiatives. So thank you so much for your work. It's really a pleasure to listen.
Yes, thank you so much for the feedback.
Thanks so much, Jasmine and Catherine. And next we have David Tortellini, who is presenting a talk called What's in My Digital Cup? Specialty Coffee Roasters and Their Digital Discourses of Flavor.
Hi, thank you. Give me 1 second. I am pulling up my presentation. Can you all see my screen? I hope so. So thank you. My name is David Tortellini. I am a doctoral student at Purdue University in the American Studies Department. And heads up, there are some images in this presentation which I have redacted due to the nature of how I am introducing them. So this work is based on my doctoral dissertation work, and I'm looking at how our senses and understanding the way we look at ourselves and our body have a direct tie to how the colonizers in the West use methods of epistemology to teach how the body erases non-Western understandings of the body. Sorry, a little jumbled. And I'm primarily looking at our sense of flavor, especially within the specialty coffee industry, and how we are seeing online in the coffee industry that all aspects of our lives being reassembled. And this includes our senses, and by extension, I argue, the understanding of ourselves. And I argue that these spaces have a profound effect also how we taste and engage with the physical world. And in tandem with how the roasters create discourses around flavor, we see them invoke the exoticization of communities outside the West through coffee sourcing stories, I call them. In these stories, they justify their decisions and subjectivity by situating themselves as being modern compared to coffee farmers they're working with. And I argue that this is in tandem with the arguments that Edward Said presents with Orientalism. This is an example of some of the tools that they use. This is the primary one. It's called the SCA coffee flavor wheel. The coffee flavor wheel uses
Hey, David, not to interrupt you, but we're not getting your slides.
Oh, let me see what's going on. So sorry about that. Can y'all see that now?
Yes, I
We're
think so.
not getting the full screen
you're not getting
presentation.
the full screen.
If you hit the present one, it might give you a full screen.
Let me see. Because I just did. Let me see if it works now. Is it working?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay. So let me go back real quick. My argument is based on my dissertation work, where I argue how our sense of flavor and our sense of understanding the world is tied to colonialism and imperialism. And I'm looking at how coffee roasters use digital spaces to digitize our senses, and it has a profound effect on how we view and taste the world. And in tandem of them using tools like the Specialty Coffee Association's Coffee Flavor Wheel, they also use coffee stories, which are forms of exoticizing communities by saying the coffee farmer is always situated as lesser than the roaster. But in reality, these coffee farmers are people who are doing this out of passion projects. And I'll explain a little bit more about some of these roasters. This is what the coffee industry calls their coffee flavor wheel. This was created in the West in the 1990s based on how the wine industry understands flavor. And some of the flavors, if you ever look at the wheel in depth, some of the flavors include tasting notes like petroleum jelly, like Vaseline, is a coffee flavor. Leather. But then we also have things like blueberry, strawberry. We even have mango. But these are all the flavors of blueberry, mango, and including petroleum jelly that were tasted in university labs in the United States that were described. For example, the blueberry definition in coffee is based on Smucker's jam. In my methods and key texts, this work is an embodiment of an interdisciplinary spirit. So part of my work, as you see in this photo, is I attend coffee expos hosted by the specialty coffee industry and their shareholders. So in there, I'm performing autoethnographic work. I am going to presentation panels, hearing how the coffee industry talks about flavor. I am tasting coffees. In this photo, it's actually a cupping of coffees. I wasn't participating in that cupping, but I have participated in cuppings before. I'm also interviewing coffee roasters using mixed methods of surveys, Zoom, and in-person interviews of all over the country, so to understand the positionality on the use of digital spaces and how they understand and define flavor. I'm using tools like CTDA to look at how coffee roasters use their digital technologies and spaces to introduce and distribute their interpretations of how we should define the lives and products of coffee roasters through taste. I'm looking at how they use Instagram to announce new coffee and how e-commerce sites that they use are enactions of their cultural identities and viewpoints of the world. For example, with Instagram, they're using Instagram to gain followers, but also to make a flashy display of flavor. But e-commerce is a little bit more nuanced and refined, and they're using the e-commerce primarily for transactional. Part of the text I use is Andrew Rodder's Empire of the Senses, which creates this basis on that the vestiges of understanding our senses have ties to imperialistic systems, where somebody would say, this dish in imperial India, as an example given in a book, is considered adherent because it tastes like XYZ and it needs to be refined to suit the British palate. And here are my arguments: that we should be looking at the coffee roaster websites and the Instagrams and how they talk about the lives of the farmers with a grain of salt. They use these narratives of contributing to help the farmer because they want to sell products. When many of the farmers I talked to, some of them can understand flavor in a more complex manner than the coffee roasters, but they don't want to tell the roasters because they're afraid of roasters not buying their coffee, which has obviously a direct impact on the economics means. Also, these roasters, the photos the coffee roasters use of farmers are them dirty, disheveled. They're working on a farm. They're out and about. Of course, things are going to be a little muddy. They use those photos to paint this picture of the farmer being downtrodden, but I was just at Expo over the weekend and I was meeting coffee farmers who have MBAs from universities like Michigan State, who grew up in places like LA, and they decided to move back to where their family's from because they love coffee. And we should be looking at our senses beyond a somatic perspective, that things like happiness and memory-induced moments can be flavor responses as well. But most of the literature you read about flavor and our senses are based on a somatic definition. And to understand flavor is going to be a little tricky. It's going to push you outside your comfort zone, but it also means we're engaging with our bodies from a non-Western centric standard. And that coffee roasters are willing to adapt a new flavor system if there's one available. That they want to make these changes at both the pedagogical and marketing level, but you have people like the SCA and mega companies such as Starbucks, Folgers, and Nesquik who don't. Like, you would say, hey, let's look at this new method, and then the SCA would create pressure on that roaster, and it means they don't have access to certain farmers. They don't have access to certain coffees. So we're seeing the SCA literally, like an expression we say in Argentina, is like you put your thumb on the person to squash them. That's what we're noticing. And thank you. Sorry for the technical delay.
Hi, David. Thanks for your presentation. I found it fascinating. You're making me think about a lot of things in the art arena, actually, which is interesting. I'm super interested in this take on the equation between the way that coffee roasters are delineating what flavor is and colonialism and what that means and how it carries forward. And so then I start thinking about, what is that equation? How do we live with it? And since you're going to these activities and going to these tastings and things, what do you do about it? And I was thinking about performance art a lot. There's a group called the Yes Men that you might want to look into if you don't know. They're an activist group that kind of go in and mess with systems, like the ways in which systems function, to get them to start think and see where the change can happen. So if a Starbucks is throwing up a flag, what do you do to change that? If you make the system that is the different anti-colonialist version of this thing, right? How do you get it deployed? I often think about, maybe it isn't taken up wholly in the first round, but where do you take it so that it has to be seen, and how do you present it in that way? And how does that making something visible make it also something that is known, which makes it something that becomes a pressure towards something else? And I'm thinking a lot, let's see where else we are. I'm thinking a lot about this, the refusal, in terms of the ways that other folks were talking about it and where we start to put that in. So I would encourage you through your research, because you already seem to be thinking about this, those ways in which you twist that system and present the different thing, study it, present it, and then really, what I like to call it, a sort of shaming of institutional settings, especially, so that they see that this thing exists. You treat people and things differently. You redefine the ways that things work. And I will say that I was thinking about this with Schadenfreude, and I can't even say that word, but it's, if we don't keep deploying this word, especially in reference to systems that deal in people, and we want to be dealing in different ways, and we create our own word, which is going to take some work, right? I always feel bad because I'm always like, do the thing that's going to take you extra work to do the thing, but in the long run will make a different kind of impact. And that's what I got. I really appreciate the work that you're doing and going into the belly of the beast to do your work. And I encourage you to look at a few artists that are doing that as well, because that's how we start to make people think differently. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope that was helpful.
So much.
Yeah.
Yeah, really fascinating research, David. And thank you, Stephanie, for those comments. Thank you all for sticking with us. We have two more presenters. And next up, we have Hagar Masood, who's presenting a talk called Wooden Room, Wedding Room.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here. And I'm grateful for all of you here and for Stephanie Dinkins and Disco Network. And I'm Hagar Masood. I'm an interdisciplinary artist and interested in themes of gender, accessibility, disability in a context of female genital mutilation, oral history, and technology. So I'm working on, like the presentation today, it's called Panting Voices, Tales of the Backstage. It's about gender accessibility and in this context. And today I'm presenting my recent documentation for my recent show. It was in March. It's a social engaged project based on collective memory, female genital mutilation, and the childhood trauma. So I spoke with women that they had this procedure, and I collected stories from them. And then I'm sharing it in public space, but in semi-public space also, it's living room. And then I also worked on casting vulva for survivals, and then transformed it to bronze mold and added pearl instead of the disabilities that happened after the procedure. And I'm working on this project in two different ways, including AI and ChatGPT, and also including virtual reality. But the other two parts will be done by June. So now I'm presenting Wedding Room, and we're gonna watch the movie for 4 minutes-ish, and then I would like to hear from all of you, but I can also give an intro about the installation. It's a multimedia installation project that addresses the traumatic impact of female genital mutilation, which takes place across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, rooted in the cultural beliefs about femininity, marriageability. The installation reimagines the colonialized interiors of Egyptian middle class living rooms in the gallery setting, especially in this duration in the 90s and 80s, where narrators share their experiences of female genital mutilation that occurred in such spaces. And the ambience includes serving traditional Egyptian tea and tropical fruits, and performance of myself peeling oranges for guests, along with casted vulva molded in bronze. And so this was the documentation. It's a film documentation about the project. And I decided to make it in Arabic, and there were no translation in the show. So I decided to keep the video without translation as well, to keep it, because I see translation is colonial, and I would prefer to keep the subject as it is understood for certain communities. But also I'm working on it to record different stories with women here in the US, so they can record with their own language, and also other women all over the world, because this is happening everywhere. It's not for a particular place. And thank you so much. I'm just looking forward to hear some feedback or any questions. Thank you.
I will jump in first. Is that okay, Lisa?
Yeah.
No, thank you for, in a sense, taking us to your show, so to speak. Unfortunately, we couldn't be sitting there sharing tea with you and experience it in real time, which I think would have been decidedly different. But it's wonderful that the digital world can give us a taste of that. And so one of the things I'm intrigued about, and I'm fascinated, is thinking about how you transport people to domestic space, physically, materially, cognitively, experientially. And right, I think part of what I'm intrigued with is the place of domestic space, the politics of domesticity, and how oftentimes familiar, comfortable, desired spaces can be places of violence, disassociation, and comfortable alienation, I'll call it, where there's this unspoken, I think you said unspoken bodies, I think the language you use, there's this unspoken familiarity that hangs in the air, and how that familiar becomes unfamiliar. And I love the idea of bringing people to the physical space and then actually having them sit and inhabit that space and have to understand the stories. But I love how you ended by saying you're not translating it, because it allows people to, in a sense, to at least folks who don't speak the language of the exhibition to actually fit in that disassociation and fit with that discomfort. And particularly Western English speakers have to embrace the fact that you don't have a place of privilege and power to understand the language and translate as you like and feel. And you have to feel that distance and powerfully experience that realization of maybe this story is not for you. So embrace that piece of being othered for a moment in a linguistic way. So, and I think I love the idea of thinking about collective memory, and it makes me think about one of my books I love is Pierre Levy's Collective Intelligence, and thinking about ways in which, early version of saying the digital worlds can help us bring us particularly together and create more thoughtful communal interactions by using the digital to, in a sense, leverage collective intelligence. So I'll pass the mic to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much for your feedback. I really enjoyed it. And it's true that people who don't understand the language, they are dissociated somehow. Because also I experienced here, like people are dissociated from the experience somehow, because maybe it's not familiar to the society here, but it's familiar in certain immigration communities in the US and other places. So thank you so much.
My visceral reaction as a Californian when you started peeling the orange was, oh my gosh, that's not how we would do it. But it made me very worried for the orange. The suspense of seeing the blade go really deep sometimes and then very shallow. And it made me think a lot about genital mutilation. I don't know if that was your intention. And then the castings of unblemished or unharmed vulvas seemed to be like a reparative gesture of, well, there was a moment in a space and time when it wasn't like that. So those are my very personal takes on it. I think if you were in a culture where people peeled fruit differently, it would be different. But I've never been in such suspense or worry over watching fruit being cut before.
Yeah, thank you so much. Totally appreciate it. I actually meant to keep the orange as the body, and there is a real connection between the woman's story and the orange, because this woman specifically, she's unhealed from the trauma and she's 50-year-old, and then she said, okay, I'm going to participate with you just to help you, but doesn't make me feel good at all. And in her voice, you can get the sense of worry.
It seems like Hagar might have cut off, but hopefully we can connect outside of this presentation. So we have one more speaker, Nisa Asgarali Hoffman, who's going to be presenting her presentation called Ambiguously Brown, Resisting the Myth of Racial Authenticity in Genetic Ancestry Testing.
Right. Hi, everyone. I'm hoping to share my screen okay. All right, can you see my slides? All right. Okay, wonderful. Hi, everyone. I am Nisa Asgarali Hoffman, she, her. I am a part of the BCAT lab, and I'm co-advised by Catherine Knight Steele and Sheena Areti in the Department of Information Studies, which is my home department. And I'm excited to be in conversation with all of the wonderful scholars that have presented today thus far. In the summer of 2015, it seemed all anybody in the US could talk about was Rachel Dolezal. At the time, Dolezal was president of the Spokane, Washington chapter of the NAACP. In a now infamous interview, a reporter confronted Dolezal about whether she is Black, as she had claimed, or if she was in fact white. Dolezal walks off looking confused, but the damage had already been done. The video immediately went viral. The summer of Rachel Dolezal was filled with late-night jokes, televised interviews with psychologists and race scholars, and countless think pieces. This flurry of attention culminated in a nationally televised Today Show interview in which Dolezal firmly asserted, "I identify as Black." In the years since, there have been numerous other claims of so-called race fakers, with some cases achieving more attention than others within the US context. In Dolezal's memoir, In Full Color, Finding My Place in a Black and White World, she claims that by proclaiming herself transracial, she is challenging white supremacist ideology. She argues that by showing that a white person can identify as Black, she is proving the socially constructed nature of race and is invalidating the notion that race is a biological fact. While many dismissed Dolezal's argument, there were some that publicly came to her defense, agreeing that her logic was a valid deconstruction of race. Many of these debates played out on Twitter, where everyday people, celebrities, and academics alike were debating what qualified a person as white or Black. In particular, the Ask Rachel hashtag was employed by users to pose questions to Rachel in order to decipher her true racial identity. While these questions were often amusing, they also revealed a larger question. Why does racial authenticity remain so salient in the American construction of identity? This notion of racial authenticity in the American consciousness is one that has fascinated me. As someone that was born in the Caribbean nation of Trinidad, my conception of my identity has never been based on an ethos of authenticity. In the Caribbean, we tend to celebrate the murkiness. The juxtaposition between a culture of not needing to define and one that seems rooted in definition felt conflicting. I acknowledge that my understanding of the world is shaped by the Caribbean experience as well as the experience of diaspora. Therefore, I make no claims to objectivity and instead offer that my unique positioning has given me the lived experience of both Caribbean and American logics of race, offering me a double consciousness that enriches my analytical capability. Therefore, as I began to wonder if and how colonial logics of quantification and authenticity embedded in scientific performances of authenticity making, such as genetic ancestry testing, were challenging the Caribbean ethos of the créolité, as Glissant says, the celebration of our heterogeneity, I decided to investigate. I began researching this topic and found a genre of videos I had not encountered before. The YouTube Genetic Ancestry Test, or GAT, reveal video, and recognizing that looking to the discourse on social platforms can illuminate how publics process social phenomenon, such as in the case of hashtag Ask Rachel, I was led to the following research questions. What role does the platform possibilities of YouTube play in shaping the discourse around racial identity? And how do Caribbean YouTubers use reveal videos of their genetic ancestry test results to engage with their followers and commenters in discourses of racial authenticity? In looking to the public discourse sparked by Caribbean genetic ancestry test reveal videos, I hope to illuminate the alternate modes of racial signification that differ from the American context, and whether this can create space for less rigid and fixed frames of racial identity than one based in authenticity. My theoretical framework is Caribbean existentialism. Existentialism involves sorting through the haziness of lived experience in an attempt to make meaning of one's existence. I utilize this term existentialism not as a theoretical category, but rather as a method of reading and interpreting the work of Caribbean thinkers. Doing so follows the tradition of reading Frantz Fanon's body of work as foundational to Black existentialism, wherein Fanon describes a Eurocentric narrow construction of humanity, a condition he refers to as the crisis of European man, and attempts to broaden the understanding of humanity in a racialized body through descriptions and analysis of his own lived experience. In looking to the descriptions of the lived experience of Caribbean people as theory formation, I reject a narrow Western conception of theory. Here, Caribbean existentialism gives us a way of thinking about the human condition rooted in the Caribbean experience, with recognition that Caribbeanness is a significant modifier, indicating a specific history that infuses this experience with unique political and social meanings. It's important for me to clarify that when I talk about Caribbean existentialism, I am focusing on the Anglophone and Francophone Caribbean. This is important because the Hispanophone Caribbean has its own long and complicated history with race, with its own unique, complex system of racial categories. I implore CTDA as the primary method to examine YouTube GAT reveal videos and their video comment threads. And here you can see that I am using an analytical intersection of the technological artifact and user discourse, the YouTube platform, videos, and comment threads framed by cultural theory or Caribbean existentialism to unpack semiotic and material connections between form, function, belief, and meaning of information and communication technologies. So I'm going to present just one kind of major finding. I have several in this work that I'd like us to ponder together. Long form storytelling. Platform signification. Answering the question, what am I, by reading the body as text. In reviewing the etymology of the word platform, the first and oldest definition Gillespie highlights from the Oxford English Dictionary is architectural, a raised level surface on which people or things can stand, usually a discrete structure intended for a particular activity or operation. In reveal videos, Caribbean creators place themselves on a discursive platform. By positioning themselves as the only focus within the video frame, they implicitly invite viewers to listen to their stories and read their bodies as a text, using the comment section as a mediating technical environment for this discursive practice. For Caribbean creators, these videos perform to platform the body and present it as a contested discursive site. They explicitly invite viewers to read their bodies as texts. There is a reveal of the creator's results, and while the audience knows this is part of the trope, many videos still ask some version of the question, what am I? This question can appear in various places, such in the video title, as a text overlay, or in the description box. But with this question, the creator places themselves on a platform, inviting viewers to read the body in a co-constructed performance of signification. And speaking of race as the floating signifier, Hall states, insofar as what we are talking about is the system for classifying difference, the body is a text, and we are all readers of it. We go around looking at this text, inspecting it like literary critics. Closer and closer for those very fine differences, there are such small differences. And then when that doesn't work, we start to run like a true structuralist. We start to run the combinations, not so big nose, rather fuzzy hair, a sort of largish behind. We are readers of race. That's what we are doing. And the body is here, which you know is cited. The very obviousness of the visibility of race is what persuades me that it functions because it is signifying something. It is a text which we can read. In Hall's positioning, the body is without agency, and this reading is done by all that visually survey it. Yet in YouTube GAT reveal videos, Caribbean creators are not passive or lacking agency. Rather than assuming there is one way in which their bodies may be read, they directly ask the question, what am I? Inviting viewers to not only read their bodies, but to explicitly display those readings in the comments. In doing so, the internalized and normally subconscious practice of reading the body becomes an externalized process, a text that is also then positioned on a platform, positioning itself for interrogation by other viewers and the content creator themselves. So I'll wrap up by saying that I believe that the Creole imagination is why I use Caribbean existentialism. It offers a liberatory reimagining of race. And I believe that in doing so, as someone else already brought up, Glissant argues that the beauty of Creolite is that identity is conceived as an archipelago of signifiers, none of which enjoys primacy over the others, and whose unity lies not in the fact of possessing a single source, but rather in the complex amalgamation of these myriad forces which hold themselves in relation to each other. Though genetic testing is posited as an objective truth, it is only one story in our myth-making to understand our existence. Thank you so much for your time.
I will jump in here, and I think you did a wonderful thing to end a note on just a Rachel Dolezal shout out. That's always makes people smile and chuckle a little bit. But as a person whose grandmother's from Trinidad, it's good to hear people questioning the nature of racial identification, geography, place, space, and progeny in the context of the Caribbean. I love that you're doing this project, and I like that you're owning your kind of bifurcated subject position and doing a quasi-Gunnar Myrdal exegesis of Caribbean racial logics and the perception of racial authenticity. And one of the things that I found, and from my perspective, most interesting is I find this juxtaposition of these two questions. And I think Jasmine dropped it in the question, the chat, the what are you question versus what am I question. And right, those are clearly two different questions. There's an external question, there's an internal question. And it seems like you are asking that internalized question of how, people are thinking about their identity that's related to that question of externalized identification and how it relates to one's body, color, race, identity, care, skin, all the kind of phenotypic references and signifiers of race. And it also puts this question of what is the necessity of classification, and really turning upside down the perceptions of comfort with race in certain geographical spaces and places, and pushing the idea that there's a embedded human desire to understand one's identity, and deploying science in a way to be the true arbiter of authenticity, to avoid the questions of what am I, how I define myself, to deploy science to speak. And we've always thought about reducing racial identity to these readable texts, whether it be skin, whether it be other kind of phenotypic features. But now this new text is being driven, and it's the genetic test. And that's supposed to be the true arbiter. But it's as difficult to read as the visual cues of race and identity. But it gives someone comfort because right now, no longer it's being based on your eye and seeing or sound or experience. It's being driven by external force that seem to be objective and produce a truth. And I'm intrigued mostly also about the reveal videos, right? I'm going to have to dig up some reveal videos. It's just making me think about these college admission reveal videos where people are like, oh no, I didn't get to Harvard. Oh yes, I've gotten to here at this place. And there's this whole landscape of revealing all kinds of things. And what is the desire to actually publicly reveal this quasi-authenticating process of genetic testing to the world to say, actually, I don't have to be asked the question, what are you? Because I know what I am. So on that note, I will end my comments and thank you. I think this is really totally fascinating. It's a wonderful project.
Yeah, and I will keep my comments brief if you all can hear and see me. I'm fascinated by this as well. I think Creole existentialism is a really interesting place to land and to think this through because of the way that the mix works and the mexa. And what you made me think about through your talk was not only the reveal, but the endpoint of what we're running towards or what we're hoping for through this testing. And I think this is part of the ways in which now we have a kind of quote unquote proof of what we are, right? So the scientific, we have the things that we read, as you were saying, the acts that we do, and then the gatekeeping, and then the reinscription of the colonial or the denial of the colonial. And I encourage you to take that and keep looking at it, because I think it's a really fascinating train of thought, thinking about not only what and how we're read, what the body as text is, but how we want to be read and what the consequences or what the opportunities in that are. That's all I got.
All right, we are at the end. Thank you so much for being here, and to all of the graduate scholars for really amazing research and art. Thanks to the PIs as well for joining us and providing comments. I'm just gonna blast a final slide. If you want to stay in touch with the Disco Network, you can keep in touch on social media, and hope to see you at one of the upcoming events, the Search Engines event or the Disco Summit. All right, see you. Have a good night.
Thanks for moderating,
Thank
Juan.
you.
Appreciate it.
Great job.
Take care,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. This was amazing. Thank you all so much for being here.
Good to see everybody.
Hey, you all. I just wanted to say we did it. Yay. Thank you, Charisse.
Hello, sorry. Thank you so much. This was awesome. Thank you, Nisa, also for staying on, because I know you had other commitments and stuff. So just appreciate it. I'm sorry for that.
Yeah, no worries. I just wanted to let you know I got another GA to go and start the thing.
Okay.
So I'm fine. So I'm gonna
Okay,
go
cool.
over and
Okay.
enjoy some bowling now.
Okay, yes,
Bye.
have fun. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'll see you in 2 weeks. All right.
Thank
See ya.
you.
Bye-bye. Great job today.